but I'd like to welcome everybody to a really exciting talk today. We have Bob Davis and Lingling Wei, both of the Wall Street Journal, here to talk about their new book, Superpower Showdown, how the battle between Trump and Xi threatens the new Cold War. And Lingling and Bob are two former colleagues of mine and friends, and have a lot of admiration and respect for the work that they've done on covering the US-China trade war, but also the work they've done previously. So, Bob is kind of legendary in the Wall Street Journal's DC bureau as a guru on trade and global economic policy. We started off covering sovereign wealth funds together once upon a time when that was the biggest issue in the global economy. And Lingling and Bob both reported from China, but Lingling is a native of China and really made a name for herself covering the subprime crisis in the US before people knew what that was. And they collaborated for many years, both based out of the Beijing Bureau, doing lots of great on-the-ground reporting. And the work they put into putting this book together really was the culmination of them being on both sides of the US-China trade divide, from Lingling reporting from Beijing and Bob reporting from DC. So really a dynamic duo we have here. And just going to say a few words about the book itself. A lot of people say that journalism is the first draft of history. And I think we all can see that events have moved very quickly since the conclusion of the phase 1 trade agreement between the US and China. But I think if you look at much of what's captured in this book, especially the way that they really vividly bring out some of the key characters in the Trump administration and in the Xi administration, it really stands the test of time. And beyond just covering the trade war, it really has a great history, very readable, very engaging history of the US-China economic relationship, and also the way that Lingling and Bob's families were both intertwined in that history and how it's impacted them on a personal level. So welcome to our guests. Thank you all both for joining us. I'll maybe start off with a first question, and I'm going to ask a few questions, but would love for all of our guests to submit their own questions and what they're interested in. You can use the Q&A button on your screen to submit questions. I will take those and then put them to our speakers. We have just a bit over an hour with them. We're trying to get everybody out of here around 4:30 so everybody can make their way to their respective happy hours. But it's really a great pleasure to have them and prepare your questions while I'm asking a few of my own. So the first one I wanted to start off with, and I'd love to get both Bob and Lingling your perspective on this, but the subtitle of your book is How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War. And I'd love to get your assessment on how far we are since when your book was published to today towards that Cold War, and whether we are actually already in a Cold War, and what your assessment of that is.
Well, why don't I just take a shot at it? I mean, I think Lingling and I have had different views on that, but I think we might be, well, Lingling could speak for herself, but thought it was further along than I did, and I've come to agree with her. I mean, the difficulty is, how do you date a Cold War from what, and the old Cold War, the formal Cold War with the Soviet Union, you can pretty much date to Winston Churchill's speech in Missouri, 1950, early 1950s, where he talked about an Iron Curtain. And I think, now it's possible you could date it to August of this year, when There was one speech after another by Trump officials, Secretary of State Pompeo, the National Security Advisor O'Brien, and two others, laying out the ideological fight between these two countries. And yeah, I think we're pretty far along. It doesn't mean we'll pick a different subtitle, or at least, you know, how the Cold War is playing out or something of that sort.
Sure. I, just add a little bit to what Bob just said. I totally agree that we're already in a Cold War. However, I probably would date it even a little bit earlier in terms of the, the event that probably would mark the beginning of this new Cold War. I would say the beginning really started when President Xi Jinping of China announced the decision to impose this national security law on Hong Kong. It's not really, unlike the first Cold War, right? It was Churchill, as Bob mentioned, declared basically the start of the Cold War. All China did at the time was just, announcing the decision to impose law. But why would that be defining moment? Because really to a lot of us, that was the time when what started 2 years ago was merely a trade confrontation between U.S.-China. Became a broader confrontation between a U.S.-led democratic world and China's authoritarian system. Everything's the decision to impose a law on Hong Kong. You saw, one democratic country after another, basically, joining the U.S. camp, getting really tougher on China on human rights and a slew of other issues. And China also increasingly, become so aggressive and assertive. You saw what happened across the border with India. You saw, what's happening these days across the street, Taiwan street. That's why I think that what China did with Hong Kong was really the moment when the Western world started to realize that, this is something we have to confront with, and formed a united front of sort. But of course, the question is, how solid this new alliance is, right? And what really is going to happen going forward.
You bring up a great point there, Lingling, about the importance of stability in the relationship over time. And I've always thought that the US and China both sought to create a more stable equilibrium in the relationship historically. And one of the things I think we've seen is a movement towards instability and towards unpredictability from both sides. I'd love to get your perspectives on how the Trump administration's operated differently in the way it's engaged China versus previous administrations, and what surprised the both of you the most in how they approached the relationship, and also what surprised the Chinese side the most from what they've seen out of the Trump administration?
Well, and the Trump administration has taken a different tact toward China. Whatever we want to call it, a Cold War, a confrontation, whatever you choose. I mean, that was building before that, certainly. It was building under the Obama administration, mostly under the Obama administration. Things were getting a little hairier. The US was starting to be concerned about technology theft, pressure on US companies, Chinese military action in the South China Sea. But Trump was the first president Really, the first well, no, let me take that back. Trump was the first president since Bill Clinton to campaign as a significant part of his campaign about China. Bill Clinton campaigned on China on human rights, and I think was serious about it. That was not about 3 years after the Tiananmen Square protests and the crackdown. But Donald Trump, when he was campaigning against it, was campaigning essentially on economic grounds. They're ripping us off. The people who came before me, the presidents before me were idiots. Only I'm the only one tough enough to take on China. And it wasn't as if he came in and then, issued one order after another order after another order. It was, as I think, as we lay out quite a bit in the book. I mean, it was pretty, fits and starts. For the first year, he didn't really take on China at all. His focus was on North Korea, and he was trying to get China to help with them. But over time, as North Korea kind of faded as an issue, at least as an issue that was going to lead to a war anytime quickly, and his original views about economics and trade came to the fore, he has been the president much more than any other who's looked at the trade and economic issues between the two countries in a negative way. Bill Clinton, again, there's a lot of parallels with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton also looked at economic issues, but for him, the idea was to engage China, to wrap China into a web of dependency so that China would depend on the US, would change. And Trump basically has wound up rejecting that, and we're in a period where engagement is we're moving away from the period of engagement to the period where it's mainly confrontation, and that is Trump's contribution, whatever you think of it, but his contribution to U.S.-China relations.
And Lingling, what would you say would be the biggest surprise for you, and also for the Chinese sources that you talk with about the Trump administration?
Sure. I would say for me personally, would be the intensity of the pressure tactics from the Trump administration. It just one after another, piling on tariffs, one after another. And it oftentimes really through Zhongnanhai, the leadership in Zhongnanhai off balance, especially at the beginning. I think Beijing really has misread Washington from day one. They misread, the kind of how much the attitude in America, the attitude toward China has changed. For the longest time, whenever you talk to Chinese officials, they would always tell you that, for the U.S.-China relationship, the most important thing, the most important foundation on which the relationship is built on is the economic relationship. So because China has such a huge market, U.S. businesses, couldn't really afford to lose this market. So that has been the Chinese leadership thinking all along. So years after years, the top leaders spent a lot of energy basically cultivating relationship with business community. However, they really overlooked how their actions have changed the politicians' attitude toward China and the ordinary Americans' attitude toward China. Yes, the business community still want to invest in China, still want to expand in China, still want access to China. But even they, over time have got less enamored with China, the market, because, the Made in China 2025 and other government policies just, put a lot more pressure on foreign businesses, basically either my way or highway or no way, right? So the the leadership just spends so much energy focusing on the business community, and then at the same time thinking that, whatever we do, they will still, try their best to get in, so we can just do whatever we want. Didn't really realize that their action gradually over the year alienated not only, ordinary voters in the U.S., politicians in the U.S., but even the traditionally their strongest support, i.e., in the business community. So I think that's one of the biggest misjudgment or miscalculations the Chinese authorities have made over the past few years.
That's a great point. I'd love to just follow up a little bit on that, because one of the things that we've seen over this period is the growing importance of technology to the U.S. economy. So, the top 5 most valuable U.S. technology companies make up 20% of the S&P 500 index. So, hugely valuable, hugely important. And for many years, those companies have been denied access to China, despite, many of the infamous moments of attempts like Mark Zuckerberg asking Xi Jinping to name his child, or doing the famous smog jog in Beijing to try to get market access. Do you think that there's the technology industry, the shift of value in the economy towards technology, and China's decision to basically block all U.S. Internet companies from having fair market access was a key part of that? And what did your reporting say about the importance of technology in the evolving relationship between U.S. business and the Chinese government?
Well, I mean, it's huge. It was a trade battle to start with, certainly. Key issues, right? As you point out, U.S. companies were barred from, at least U.S. Internet companies were barred from China for an administration that looked at reciprocal trade agreements. That clearly was, unfair, and that was one of the things they tried to change. Now they had no illusion or semiconductors, where semiconductor investment would be. That was one of the big issues, and totally animating everything was the question of whether the Chinese government and Chinese companies
I think we're losing Bob a little bit there. Lingling, do you want to jump in?
Oh, sure. And sure, the whole issues involving technology certainly at the forefront of the Cold War now. And we're seeing that the U.S., the Trump administration, basically piling one anti-China action after another, and mostly involving sanctions against Chinese tech companies. And as you pointed out earlier, it's all about reciprocity, right? The administration's argument is that China, for a long time, never really gave American tech firms any kind of access to the Chinese market. So I guess, that's one of the big reasons why the administration now is going after the Chinese tech firms so aggressively. And another issue is this, blending a lot of, the whole issues involving national security, with issues purely about trade and economic, matters. So the lines the line between those two areas is becoming increasingly blurry. So, a lot of times these days, you see the sanctions against Chinese companies not really because of trade practice or economic problems. It's really because the suspicion or allegations that the Chinese government might use the tech developed by those Chinese firms to spy on American citizens. So you see that increasingly this the crossing the blending of those two different areas, trade, economic issues, and national security issues.
Yeah, that's a great point, is that national security has become much bigger of a focus in the relationship. And we've seen that with the proposed bans on TikTok and WeChat by the administration. I'm not sure anybody could tell us where that stands today, because it changes by the hour, it seems. But I'm curious as to whether in your reporting that you all have done since the publication of the book, whether you've seen the key actors on the two sides change as that the issues have gone from being soybean imports to being a discussion over high technology and the ability of companies to operate like TikTok and WeChat in the US to become more of a national security set of actors versus traditional trade actors, and how do you think that influences the future direction of the bilateral relationship?
Sorry about my losing the video there. I moved, so hopefully this will be better. The bureaucratic lineup in Washington has definitely changed. I mean, for the first 3 years, there was a struggle among the economic advisors. After quite some time, Bob Lighthizer, the trade advisor, became clearly the number one person, the most significant advisor to Trump. He's clearly a nationalist, an avowed protectionist, and he moved the president, didn't take much talking him into, but he moved the president, or he gave the president, the intellectual support to put on tariff after tariff after tariff. But the trade deal was done. Again, whatever you think about it, whether you think it was a good deal or a bad deal, it's over. And it was signed in January. And so at the same time, and it is a coincidence, but at the same time as the trade deal was being wrapped up, the coronavirus was spreading to the United States. And that led to just an enormous change in the US. The president could see the impact of coronavirus on the economy, on his reelection chances. As Lingling said earlier, the crackdown on Hong Kong by Beijing also motivated the government enormously. And so now I would say the most influential China advisor is Secretary of State Pompeo. Probably number two is the Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, a former Wall Street Journal reporter, who is now outlasted, or now in his fourth National Security Advisor, which is pretty remarkable given the turnover in that administration. And he is definitely a China expert. He would call himself a hardliner. He is a hardliner, and he takes an important role. And even a person who had been elbowed out, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who had been just elbowed out by Lighthizer and also by his own incompetence, frankly, is now playing a much larger role. He's the one who was tasked to figure out the boundaries of the TikTok and WeChat executive orders. He's the one who is enforcing the crackdown and blacklisting of Huawei Technologies, the huge 5G company. So you see just a very different lineup, and that what one of the reflections is that Lighthizer, who is definitely a China hawk by most people's estimation, is now on the restraining part. He's now one of the people kind of urging moderation, trying to make sure anyway, that the relationship doesn't go entirely off the rails, because one of the casualties would be the phase one deal that he spent so much time negotiating. And he certainly still has a lot of influence, as does the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, but it is now he's facing a much more formidable constellation of advisors, including, of course, the president, who now doesn't need to be restrained because of a trade deal, who worries enormously about the stock market, but the stock market has been very strong, surprisingly strong, and who is worried about his reelection.
And Lingling, I'd love to ask you, at the same time that all of the cast of characters on the U.S. side is changing, what does the cast of characters on the Chinese side look like? And has it changed similarly, or is it the same set of folks? And what can you tell us from your contacts in Beijing about the palace intrigue there?
Sure. I wish it could be more dynamic on the Chinese side. Unfortunately, the cast of characters still centers on one person, which is the very top person, Xi Jinping. So, China's strategy really hasn't changed too much, but they increasingly are finding themselves kind of walking on a tightrope of sort. Why do I say that? So in terms of this, no matter this trade confrontation with the U.S. or now the broader confrontation in almost all areas with the U.S., China has always been reactionary in the sense that they always hit back at almost every punch thrown by the U.S. side. But increasingly, they're trying, the dilemma is, how hard can I punch back? At the beginning of the trade war, when Bob and I were covering that, it seemed like the punch back was at least in kind, right? Exactly match the kind of tariffs coming from the U.S., tariff increases coming from the U.S. And then over time, the Chinese side realized that, okay, we don't really have that many levers to pull without hurting our own economy, our own industry, and inflicting more damages on the bilateral relationship. So their choice is getting narrower and narrower. But right now it's still very much tit for tat. But faced with this kind of ever intensifying pressure tactics from the U.S. side, I do think the Chinese side is increasingly facing a tougher balance here.
And Lingling, I'd love to just ask you about two of the characters on the Chinese side, one who figures very prominently in your book and one somewhat less so, but Liu He has been kind of a key negotiator. I'd love to just ask you a little bit more, to tell us a little bit more about him and his personality and what he's like. And then also someone who's been a little bit, who's been very prominent in the US-China relationship, but has been less so of late, Vice President Wang Qishan, somebody who all of us who cover finance in China have always paid a lot of attention to. I'd love to get your assessment on the two of them and their respective roles and how that dynamic has shifted over time.
Oh, sure. That was your original question anyway, so I talked about the strategy instead. Sorry about that. So in terms of Liu He, he is very tight with Xi Jinping. He basically grew up with Xi in the same neighborhood in Beijing. They both came from very privileged communist revolutionary families, and both suffered the chaotic period of time that was the Cultural Revolution. Both of them, I think, Xi's father was banished to countryside for hard labor because he supported a book that was critical of Mao, Chairman Mao at the time. And Liu He's father, it was the fate of his father was even more tragic. He basically committed suicide during the Cultural Revolution. So they came from very similar backgrounds. They speak exactly the same kind of language. For Liu He, people really like him. He's really a nice person. Very modest, very humble, extremely hardworking. He would go to the office at 7 or late 8 o'clock latest. He would be by his office, in his office by that time, and work just really long hours. And apparently Xi Jinping the same style. I think it was Wang Qishan or someone else once commented how she always worked until like 2 a.m. every day. So they share a lot of in common, especially family background, personal histories, and all that. And Liu, he's is one of the few current Chinese leaders that have been very much exposed to Western economic philosophy in particular. He went to Harvard for a year. So there he really honed his economic expertise and his English skills. So he's always the group of officials in China who support and advocate real market-oriented changes, reforms, and especially when it comes to empowering consumers, reducing the kind of financial repression that remains, this big problem in China. However, he's also he's not a fighter, in the sense that like Zhu Rongji, right? Zhu Rongji was a fighter. When he was the vice premier, he had the governance experience. He had the political base, which support from Jiang Zemin. And he really, he was very aggressive. He's knew what he had to accomplish and he would do it. Liu He, he knew what was good for China, but he was very much constrained precisely because his close relationship with his boss, which is Xi Jinping. Because Xi Jinping's agenda really is strengthening the party's control, making the party the center of everything. That really is in conflict with the kind of reform agenda Liu He, at one point of time at least, tried to press ahead. So that's why, and plus Liu really is not a fighter. He's good at taking orders and advise, in some cases advising the top leader what to do, but he's not like would say anything that's not in line with what Xi Jinping really wants to do. So that's why you see that over the past few years we're really not seeing the kind of reforms a lot of people either inside China or outside China were expecting. When it comes to Wang Qishan, yeah, he's really a character. He's very capable, extremely capable, very savvy. His nickname is Firefighter, right? Because he is known at dealing with crisis situations during the SARS, during the financial crisis, and early the anti-corruption campaign. She trusted him so much that put him in charge of this anti-corruption campaign. And as a reward to him, job well done. Even though Wang Qishan at the time already passed the retirement age, or reached the retirement age, Xi Jinping basically said, "You did a good job. Here's the reward for you." stay on as my vice president and advising me on the U.S.-China relationship. You know, I have to say, if he were really put in charge of the U.S.-China relationship, I think wouldn't have been so bad, because he really knows how to deal with Americans. He really has a way. However, I think he probably lost. I mean, as partly my educated guess here, I think he probably lost at least, you know, part of the power struggle. You know, hardly you see his name anymore in the press, in the Chinese press, or, you know, CCTV news. You know, I think, you know, it's just for him, he's no longer being, you know, that important to Xi Jinping, given, you know, I don't know what exactly happened, but obviously she has promoted a lot of people that, you know, were more close to him than Wang Qishan was. So anyway, so right now, you know, Wang, you don't really hear much about him. So I don't think he's playing much of a role at all in the U.S.-China relationship anymore.
Got it. Well, I'd like to turn a little bit. I mean, that's great insight on some of the key actors on both sides. But I'd love to also, you know, since both of you have had really interesting experiences in China, I'd love to ask both of you a little bit about covering China as a reporter, and maybe start with Bob. You know, during your time reporting from China, what did it feel like to be an American reporter based there? And then maybe from that transition to Lingling, and what your recent experience was leaving China.
Well, for me, I mean, I was there from 2011 to 2014. You know, compared to now, as I understand it, it was easier, but easy compared to now. I mean, it's never, I don't think covering China is ever easy. You know, people complain, reporters complain rightly about the Trump administration, the difficulty in dealing with them, getting them to talk to you, getting them to say things that are truthful. It's all true, but I mean, it's nothing remotely compared to trying to cover China. You know, in China, there's no tradition of freedom of the press. There's no tradition that the top leaders, or even, you know, the sort of mid-level leaders, need to explain themselves through the press, particularly the foreign press. So that was, you know, very different and very difficult. For me personally, I'm kind of like, you know, a dinosaur in reporting with China. I didn't speak Mandarin other than to be able to order, you know, sandwiches at a Subway shop or something. So I depended enormously on the very, very, very good, you know, Chinese interns, or Chinese news assistants rather, that we had. So there was that. But also, you know, I've been in Washington for 30 years on and off, or mostly on. And so I know how to, you know, deal with Washington. And, you know, Beijing's a capital, you know, and there are many similarities between any capital. So there's warring bureaucracies, you know, there are people on the outside that you have to weigh whether they have actual information about what's going on inside, even if they're trying to be helpful. So in some ways, some of it is like any government anywhere. But in other ways, there's nothing like it. I mean, other than maybe North Korea or Cuba. I mean, the role of the Communist Party is ever present, omnipresent, everywhere, but, you know, but invisible in a lot of ways also. I mean, I would say, you know, Lingling and I covered the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of China. You know, they were not very helpful, to say the least, but at least if you had questions, you would be able to fax them, you know, to the central bank. You wouldn't get an answer, but, you know, you knew what to do. And they, even as late as 2014, used fax, not email, for whatever reason. Well, you know, the most important committee in the Communist Party is the Politburo Standing Committee It's like, well, what's the fax number of the Politburo Standing Committee? I mean, who do I even send, an email to? Who do I send a fax to? It's just, there's nothing like that in the United States. So it was very difficult, but I did not have, for myself, I didn't have the political pressure that there is now, even on foreign reporters, and more so, always more so on Chinese reporters. I never really worried about that very much. I figured if I angered the government, they'd send me home. For somebody like myself who was there, it's going to be there for 3-4 years, it would be a problem to be sent home, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. I'd go report on something else. But now, I mean, the pressure is much more intense, which Lingling can talk about much better than I can.
Yeah, Lingling, please share with us some of your recent experience. I'd love to, build on what Bob said about the experience you have reporting, but also leaving China, what that was like for you.
Sure. So I went back to China in early 2011. So that was basically dream coming true for me. I always wanted to go back to China, write about China for a reputable news organization. So that was my dream coming true. And my, for me, the biggest thing I ever had from the past 9 years, almost a decade of reporting out of China was, I got to work with Bob. Bob was way too modest about him being some kind of dinosaur in reporting in China. Not at all. He, precisely because of his Washington experiences and his experiences of doing the hard-hitting, high impact stories that really helped the entire bureau, and including myself, really elevate the kind of reporting we are aiming for. Initially I started out writing about the renminbi going up and down, and because it really never moved like a normal currency. That means the number of stories I got to write was really limited. But anyway, so he's the reason that I started to really try to think more ambitiously and basically aim high. It was tremendous experience. Bob just mentioned, back then, at least, when we wrote like a story about the PBOC, the central bank, if they're not happy about it, they would call you up. I remember, Bob, both of us were invited to tea at SAFE, the big Forex manager in China, because they were very unhappy with the profile we're writing at the time about, the Chinese, the former Wall Street bond trader Beijing had hired to run their Forex reserves. So they were very unhappy about the story, but at least they had the courtesy of inviting us over and telling us what parts of the story and what parts of the questions they had issues with. So it's not totally unlike, right, Bob, some of the most recent experiences we're dealing with. So, but gradually, even that not happening anymore. I remember during my early days in China, I would tag along on interviews with Bob, with Guo Shuqing or Zhou Xiaochuan. We still had access with that kind of people. But as time goes on, no, not even director general levels anymore. And then going forward, then not even government advisors. You just see the access getting narrower. Why? Because Xi Jinping has totally lowered the bar for state secrets. Like everything is state secret, and people are so scared of talking that would run afoul of the party line. So it's definitely getting very challenging as time goes on for all foreign correspondents working in China. So fast forward to this spring, when the foreign ministry, so what happened first was in March, early March, China expelled 3 Wall Street Journal reporters because of editorial headline. None of the 3 reporters had anything to do with, but that was in the midst of the pandemic. Obviously certain authorities wanted to basically deflect the attention, criticism at home, by basically singling out a foreign hegemon, whatever, to step their face a little bit. And then at that point, actually, a lot of us thought the worst was over. What could have been worse than that, right? Yeah, a couple of weeks later, they announced expulsions of more journal reporters and American reporters, including those working for the Journal, the New York Times, and Washington Post. So it just really, I was crushed. It was really didn't know what to do at the time, because it was just so sudden, totally not prepared, even though we knew that getting kicked out of China was always a risk that existed, but never would have thought it could have happened that way. So it really broke my heart to have to leave China now. It's such an important story, and it's even getting more important going forward with the tensions with the US, the rest of the democratic world. If only we could stay inside China and keep reporting. And what I miss the most these days is the kind of face-to-face interactions with people, officials or non-officials, or just moment pop, ordinary people. You're in China, Rick. You know how friendly they are, the ordinary Chinese people. They love to tell you their stories, even their happy stories or their sad stories. They love to talk, and they love to help. But now it's just something I can't do anymore. It just really it's killing me in that regard. But on the other hand, I can only speak for the Wall Street Journal. We now have the first transnational bureau, China bureau, in the history of the Wall Street Journal. The Global China Bureau now has bureau in China, have people in China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in me in New York, and in Washington, and someone in London. So we're just trying to tackle the China story from different angles now. And who knows how that will work out, but at least we're trying.
Well, thank you for sharing that personal experience, Lingling. That's and you guys have a great chief in Jonathan Chang right now.
Yes.
That what a task, and really important for the world to better understand China. That you all succeed in that. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience now. So if you haven't submitted your question on Q&A yet, I've got a few here, but please do so now. I'm going to start going through the list. So the first one comes from one of our professors, Mark Metcalf, who asks, and actually it's about a story that Lingling wrote about how the PRC is formulating a blacklist of US companies similar to the entities list that the US government maintains, which includes Huawei and others. That list hasn't been publicly released because of disagreements among policymakers regarding the impact of doing so. What are your current thoughts on the matter, and what was the reaction to your story?
Sure. I did have received a lot of questions about this entity list. So obviously, it's very important for foreign businesses. The difficulty in releasing that list for China, it just shows how sensitive this whole issue is. It's easier to say, "Oh, I'm going to retaliate." That's you guys be prepared. The countermeasures are coming. It's easier to really say that than actually to do that, because the leadership has to weigh the risks of pushing, punching back too hard. Because right now, as a lot of people know, that China, despite the fact that China's economy is recovering, and is recovering very fast, probably faster than US and a lot of other Western countries. However, the government still faces very, very big unemployment pressure. And also, China still lags far behind in terms of key technology like semiconductors and all that. So they do have the concern that we can't scare off foreign businesses operating in China now and lead to more unemployment problems or more supply issues for our own companies. So that's one thing that's holding them back. And another issue is the whole bilateral relationship, right? So Xi Jinping, right now, he has a bigger priority is to ensure that his hold on power remains undisputed through the remaining of his second term and up when the party gathers for another big party congress in late 2022. So he wants to make sure the whole thing is going to be a smooth ride for him. So a mishandling of the US-China relationship obviously could hurt him politically at home. So all those reasons combined help explain why there has been such a debate within the government about when to pull the trigger on the list and whether or not we should wait and see, especially after the US election, to see whether or not there's still need to publish the list or not. And also it's also a clever strategy in some sense, because just by announcing the existence of the list but not disclosing the names have the effect of keeping foreign firms on the eggshells, right? Like everybody could be on the list, but everybody, if you told the party line, you may not be on the list. So it's a way of really pressuring foreign businesses in China.
That's a great point. Nobody wants to, at the end of the day, end up on that list. I'll go to another question from Stephanie Zabel. She asks about the terminology of calling the current relationship between the US and China a Cold War. What do you, and maybe Bob, this one's for you, what do you think is the significance of that term in the debate, and does it actually influence the course of the relationship if it's viewed as a Cold War and the use of that type of language?
Well, I mean, I think what we're looking for is basically a shorthand way of describing it, right? And people understand what a Cold War is. We don't say that it's going to be the same. I mean, the last Cold War with the Soviet Union was largely a military confrontation, or mostly through proxies, thank God. But it was essentially military in nature. This is essentially economic and technological in nature, and hopefully it doesn't become military. But I think there's some criticism about using that, and doesn't that push the relations in a certain way? I mean, I suppose that there is a point to that, but on the other hand, if you use less loaded language, it doesn't give a sense of how badly things really have frayed. I mean, things are not good, and that is, the reality. Now, maybe we, the United States, wants to, get away from that, which would be, a possibility, certainly. But I mean, that's kind of the way things are at the moment. You could use different language, confrontation, and so on, but it is, things are in tough shape.
Thank you for that. Sort of a related question from James from Portugal, incoming first year, asks, what are the considerations being that are taking place right now about the possibility of a hot war between the U.S. and China. And given your expertise and talking with some of the senior administration officials on both sides, what shape would you anticipate a potential hot war taking?
Well, I'll take from Washington. I mean, a hot war is kind of what I would consider kind of an end of the world sort of scenario. I mean, you're talking about two nuclear armed countries at war with each other. I mean, we never got to that point with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had way more nuclear weapons than China, but it doesn't take a hell of a lot of nuclear weapons to entirely destroy a country. So I don't think we're close to a hot war. I don't think anybody in their right mind wants anything like that. I mean, if it were to happen, I imagine it would be over Taiwan. That always seems to be, the biggest flashpoint. If the Chinese, against their better judgment, invaded Taiwan, that would make a very difficult decision for Washington. It's not clear the United States would defend Taiwan, but it's not clear they wouldn't either. So that would probably be the flashpoint.
Lingling, what's your take on that issue and the way that China sees that potentially happening?
I think she has very strong incentives not to fire the first shot. Despite recent, aggressiveness, across this Taiwan Strait, we saw a lot of PLA warplanes, right, flying over the median lane line in the strait. Definitely. It's just a lot of warmongering, especially in some China's state-owned media. But let's hope that both sides have the wisdom and the smartness and all that to keep the war cold.
Great. We have a question from another professor, Karim here. He asks, what is the probability of trade blocs forming around the US and China? It seems like the EU might not pick a side, but how about Japan or other key developing countries in the Asia region?
Well, the US already has trade blocs, right? I mean, we have the most obvious example is the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, but there are tight trade relations throughout Latin America. There are conflicts with Europe, but there's no doubt that the US and Europe are allied on trade matters. The issue is, everybody else, right? I mean, the question really is for China, let Lingling address it, but the question really is for China. Will China be able to create, a trade bloc around it? I think Japan does not. I mean, Japan is dependent on China, but does not want to be too dependent on China. So it is also in the kind of US sphere.
Right. From China's perspective, they certainly want a bloc, but it's much easier said than done. The core issue is that China doesn't seem to be in position to compromise, not with the US, not with anyone. Japan, Europe, they share the same kind of complaints with the US when it comes to intellectual property, tech transfer, market access, all those structure issues. China is not giving up much ground on those issues with anyone. So it's really hard for them to form the kind of trade bloc Bob just explained. The U.S. has had with countries on this side. Another issue is, as we said earlier, the whole rising geopolitical tensions as a result of China's aggressiveness involving Hong Kong. That makes things even harder for Beijing. Japan, for sure, they want protection from the U.S. the European countries, as evidenced by some recent remarks by different politicians in different European countries, they share the same kind of concerns over the massive crackdown on human rights. So for China, it's still very much uphill battle for them to really get allies, the kind of allies the U.S. has.
Great, thank you for that. A related question about China's trade relations globally comes from Dale Copeland, and he asks, to what extent has China's fear of peaking in economic power and its concerns about access to raw materials and oil driven China's more assertive policies in the South China Sea, over the Malacca Strait, and in pushing the One Belt, One Road, or BRI initiatives in Asia and Europe? And also, what is your assessment of the impact that One Belt, One Road has had on China's relationships?
The whole One Belt, One Road initiative has kind of backfired in a big way for Beijing, because it has led to Chinese banks or Chinese firms seizing controls over ports or some other strategically important infrastructure all over the developing world, in Pakistan, some countries in Africa, and also deepened the debt problems for localities. So the China's image actually has suffered as a result, really not advancing Xi's agenda any further, and also got Western world, especially the US, much more suspicious, right, of China's motivations and intentions. Going forward, it talked about the energy issue. For sure, China, continues to depend a lot on the foreign countries, on foreign supply in terms of oil, natural gas, and all that. That's why I think for the next, the government is mapping out the next 5-year plan, and that would, a big component of that plan would involve, beefing up the self-sufficiency on the energy part. So, we have to wait and see exactly what kind of initiatives they're going to roll out.
Bob, anything you want to add on that?
No, I mean, I generally agree with Lingling. I guess the only thing I might add is, yes, it's backfiring, but it is a strategy, and it would be interesting. I mean, you can in kind of one sentence or paragraph, define China's international economic strategy. As trying to sign up countries to One Belt, One Road, and work with them on infrastructure, get them tied more tightly to Beijing. Well, what's the American strategy? I mean, it is, this administration has been very forceful in criticizing China and in complaining about subsidies and, this initiative and that initiative, but very, very poor in coming up with its own counter strategy other than complaining.
Thanks for that. Our UVA's Chinese politics guru, Brantley Womack, asks, have the recent moves in US-Taiwan relations made Taiwan more secure or less secure?
That's a really interesting question. The US is drawing closer to Taiwan, mostly to tweak China. There's no evidence that the president cares a whit about Taiwan. In John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor's book, he describes Trump comparing Taiwan to the size of the gigantic desk in the Oval Office, the Resolute desk, and Taiwan being the size of one of the pens that he uses. I mean, the reporting that I've done, from national security people who do care about Taiwan, say that, on some days Trump considers Taiwan to be a nice little hedge or a nice little way to get at China, and other days he considers it a pain in the neck. But in this period where the U.S. is, getting tougher with China, Taiwan becomes a bigger and bigger part of their strategy. It's an interesting evolution. So on the one hand, as I was saying about the trade representative Lighthizer, who has been, came into that office being hawkish, he's opposed to tighter relations with Taiwan, largely because he's afraid that'll spook China and do away with his trade deal. But you have people like Matt Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Director, and Pompeo, the Secretary of State, pushing harder for, economic ties with Taiwan, arms sales to Taiwan. It doesn't make it more secure or less secure. That's a really good question. I guess my answer would be probably somewhat more secure because they'd be, more closely enveloped in the U.S. penumbra. But I understand the argument that you may be, freaking out the Chinese essentially, and that's not necessarily what you want to do when it comes to Taiwan.
Great. A follow-up question from Dale Copeland. He asks about the new assertiveness of China, and what do you think is really driving that new assertiveness? Is it the fear of losing raw material access, fear of a U.S. pivot, or perhaps status and the desire for equal recognition?
The leader, the top leader himself, that's the driver for the assertiveness. With our book, Superpower Showdown, one thing Bob and I really trying to do is to, basically hit home the point that personality really drives politics. That's the case in Washington. That's also the case in Beijing. Xi's leadership style is very, very, very different from his predecessors. He's no longer, he's, very powerful and for sure, but he's no longer the kind of pragmatic Chinese leader the rest of the world has grown used to, right? Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and even Hu Jintao. For all those leaders, really the economy trumped everything else, trumped ideology, but not for Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, for him, saving the party, strengthening the party is the key, is the job. And also he also believes, China is already the world #2 economy. China has already arrived, despite in many areas, China is still lagging behind. But overall, Chinese market, Chinese consumers, Chinese students, Chinese technology, starting to really have an influence in the world. So that all helped explain the kind of assertiveness, he's doing it on a daily basis. And also, because of the fact that he does believe China has arrived, he needs to give Chinese people something else to be proud of. That is being Chinese under this one-party system. So that's why you seeing China, not backing down in every which way, you name it, right? So I think, it has a lot to do with the leadership itself.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions I'm going to tie together, but these are both about the impact of issues in Western China, including the border clashes with India and how that's impacted Chinese tech companies, but also the issues in Xinjiang with the camps there, and whether you all expect that will further scare off foreign businesses from China. So what are the impacts of some of the issues in Western China on Chinese businesses and also foreign businesses investing in China?
Bob? You can take the U.S. business
right. From the
context.
American perspective, then. If you're an apparel company, you got to be thinking twice or four times about, importing cotton from Xinjiang. The restrictions that they came out with were watered down, but it's not the end of this. And one thing we haven't talked about, the difference between a Biden administration and a Trump administration, which there would be definitely differences when it came to China. But on this issue, on human rights, I don't think you'd see any daylight whatsoever. So I think the message to foreign businesses in China when it comes to Xinjiang and doing business there is don't. I think that's a clear message. But I mean, again, so we're talking about apparel companies. It's a big business, but it's not the heart of American business in China. For the rest, they'll have to weigh it out also, right? I mean, there are a lot of reasons to diversify out of China. The worsening relationship adds another one, and I wouldn't think in a broader sense, I don't think that's going to change very much. I think you would have definitely differences between a Biden and a Trump, but I think the pressure on China from the U.S. administration would continue.
And about maybe for you, Lingling, the impact on Chinese tech companies of the app ban that went into effect as a result of the border clashes with India. Any thoughts about that?
Right. It's certainly a big blow for a lot of Chinese tech companies' global ambitions, right? They're finding their market access outside China is getting narrower and narrower. That probably explains why the leadership, basically trots out this new slogan, internal circulation. That basically means, Chinese produce stuff for Chinese companies, Chinese consumers, and instead of exporting the products outside China, let's just keep them inside. And Chinese companies increasingly rely on China's own raw material, everything just, keeps inside the border. However, this circle can also be bigger. It really depends on how big China's friend circle is these days. If it have many more friends, of course, the circle can be bigger. If they have only few friends, the circle probably just a few other more countries.
Great. Well, and I'm going to ask one last question before we part ways. And I'll just remind everybody that Superpower Showdown is a great read. So go to Amazon, go to your local bookstore, wherever, and make sure you buy a copy. We're really grateful for having Bob and Lingling join us, but also we want to make sure that you guys go out and buy their book.
Thank you.
Last question is for Bob. What should we expect to be different in the U.S.-China relationship in terms of U.S. policy in a second Trump term and in a potential Biden administration?
So let's talk about Biden first. Okay, the guy wins. He's in office. So all this sort of nonsense about peaceful transition is over. But so what does he inherit? He inherits tariffs on 3/4 of everything China sells to the United States. Even though he has said he doesn't want to focus on trade, inevitably he will. That is, that's quite a legacy, right? And that gives him, though he wouldn't have done this himself, it gives him quite a lot of leverage over China, quite a few cards that he can play. And also, I should say, I dismiss the, all the sort of nonsense that you hear about peaceful transition. But let's assume here, let's back up. So Biden wins the election, there's a 2-month transition. It's very possible that the initiatives that you see now will intensify. Things that Trump really wouldn't want to do. Sanctioning a Chinese bank. I mean, cutting off a Chinese bank from the dollar, trying to de-link the US dollar from the Hong Kong dollar, selling stealth bombers to Taiwan. I mean, one thing after another. I don't think you can put anything past them, because it would then be up to Biden to roll back things, and it would could make Biden look weak. So there's that possibility, but at the very least, he has all these tariffs to deal with, and he's not going to give them up just, to be nice to China. So what does he get for it? So that, I think that's one of the things that argues for a continuation of a confrontational policy toward China, and also on the technology front as well, and on the South China Sea. I don't think you'll see that much difference. Where you would see a difference, a big difference, I think, first of all, would be tone. Biden doesn't talk the way Trump does. Nobody talks the way Trump does. So that would be something, and that's not insignificant. But also, so again, he's got all these tariffs on Chinese goods, but he has said that he wants to, wants to act in a more multilateral fashion. He has said that he considers climate change to be an enormous issue. Obviously, dealing with a pandemic is an enormous issue. Getting the global economy back into reasonable shape is an enormous issue. For everything I just named, and also dealing with Iran is an enormous issue. Everything I just named, he needs China. And so I think you would see a greater outreach to China. One of the cards that he can play is at least some of the tariffs, So I would think that you would expect to see China policy being important, being hard in some ways, the same way as Trump, but also looking for areas of cooperation, where the Trump administration talks about areas of cooperation, but you don't really see any. So now let's switch, and Trump wins. It's interesting. I mean, the simplest prediction to make is that things get even worse, right? I mean, that, it's a second term. He doesn't have to worry about a trade deal. It doesn't look like there's a trade deal on the horizon. It's a continuation, basically, of what he's done, but an intensification as, one kind of stricture after another falls away. That's the probable outcome, but it's also possible that it's the opposite. I mean, we had an interview with John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and he says something to the effect of, it's the day after the election or the day after the inauguration, Xi Jinping calls up Donald Trump, or the other way around, and says, well, what about that phase 2 trade deal? And then they start negotiating over something. And all the tough measures that they've taken on any number of fronts, it's not that they are lifted, but they become secondary again, as they were before the trade deal was signed. I think that's, less likely outcome, but certainly not impossible. I mean, we've seen many ways, many times where Donald Trump's reversed himself, and this certainly could be one of them.
Great. Well, and Lingling, any last words or to add to that?
Oh, well, Bob just summarized perfectly, what, we expect to happen.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. And thank you to all of the attendees who joined us. Really a great discussion. And thank you both for making time, and thank you all for